This video is going to have a look at validity in psychological research. So when you do a classification, there's quite a lot of terms on there when you look at validity under research methods. You've got to know types of validity across all methods of investigation. And then you've got to be able to define and talk about a few different types, like face validity, concurrent validity, ecological validity, temporal validity. Some of these you'll be very aware of from AS, and some of them might be new terms to you. You've also got to know how to assess validity and improve validity in studies. So we're going to cover all of that in this video. So firstly, what is validity? If you asked to define it, how would you define it in an exam? Well, validity is all about whether the study produces a result that is legitimate, and also whether the study is measuring what it actually claims to measure. So it's about legitimate results and whether it's measuring what it claims to measure. Different types of validity. We're going to have a look at a few of these now. Firstly, you've got internal validity, and this is, does the study test or measure what it's supposed to measure? So a study may lack internal validity if for any reason you could argue that the results are not caused by the independent variable. So if the results were down to anything else, for example, demand characteristics or social desirability, or there was some fault in the methodology itself of the experiment, then the study lacks internal validity. External validity, on the other hand, refers to whether we can generalize the findings beyond the study setting or to wider populations or other groups. Okay, so internal validity is usually to do with inside the experiment. External validity is whether you can generalize the findings externally from your study. Like I said at the start, your specification lists a number of different types of validity you need to know about. Ecological validity is one we would have covered in AS, and this refers to whether the findings can be applied to the real world. So can we apply the findings from one setting and apply them to other settings? Okay, and it's not always just about lab studies. Okay, most people think ecological validity has got to be about lab studies, but it's whether the findings can be generalized from one setting to another setting. Okay, and yet we usually talk about labs and artificial environments because it's the easiest example to give when something lacks ecological validity. We've also got population validity. So studies often lack population validity if they can't be generalized to other populations of people. So if it was all done on men, it may lack population validity because it can't apply it to females. Or if it's only done in one country, it might lack population validity because it only applies to that culture of people. Face validity is something we wouldn't have covered much in AS. So we might have covered it in a tiny bit of detail, but you've now got to be able to explain what it is. So it's an important way of checking validity in a study. When they ask you how would a researcher check validity, face validity and concurrent validity are always on the mark scheme. So it's a very, very basic form of validity, and it's checking, does it measure what it claims to measure, simply by looking at it. So you might have a questionnaire on aggression, or you might have a test of anxiety, and you'll think, right, does this questionnaire actually measure anxiety? Does it measure aggression? And you basically do it by eyeballing it. So you'd look over it, right, do these questions actually measure anxiety? Right, do these questions actually measure aggression? That's all you're doing. You're looking at it on the face of it. So you might get a psychological expert to look at it and go, right, on the face of it, do these questions actually measure anxiety? And that is what face validity is. It's a very, very basic form of checking whether something is valid or not. Concurrent validity, again, this is another important way of checking the validity in a study. Remember, if they ask you the question, how do you check the validity? Talk about face validity, talk about concurrent validity. They're on every single mark scheme. So this is the extent to which the measure relates to an existing measure. And the easiest way to give you is an example. So you've created a new IQ test, and you want to know whether that IQ test is actually valid. So what you do is you get the scores from, you give your IQ test to someone, they complete it, you get your score. And then you compare that with a very well-established IQ test. So the Stanford Binet test is the most commonly used IQ test. So you'd compare your scores to a very well established IQ test. And then, if there's a close agreement in the scores, so if there's a high correlation coefficient of plus 0.8, then it shows you that it has high levels of concurrent validity. So if the scores are similar, high concurrent validity. If the scores are completely different, then have low levels of concurrent validity. Overall validity just basically refers to whether the findings from a particular study can hold true over time. So over the course of time, will the results be found over and over and over again? So for example, the ASH study happened in the 1950s during a time in American history when conformity was very, very high. So a lot of people have said that ASH's study actually lacks temporal validity because it took place in such a conformist era in American history that the results wouldn't happen now. People are far less likely to conform now than they were in the 1950s. So how do we go about improving reliability? Well, one way is to use psychological experts. Psychological experts can always check methodology or behavioural categories before you actually conduct the test. And this could also be a way of checking the face validity. Psychological experts will be able to have a look at your methodology on the face of it. Right, yes, that's a valid test. Or no, what you've done doesn't quite measure what you want to. You need to go back and check it. And they will ensure a test is valid, that they have the knowledge, they've got the experience to ensure that tests are actually measuring what they're supposed to measure. When we're looking at experimental research, one good way of improving validity is to use a control group, okay? Because that will then assess whether any changes in the dependent variable are actually due to you changing the independent variable. So control groups allow us to assess whether a change is actually down to the independent variable or not. We can also make sure we use standardized procedures because that will limit any or minimize any investigator effects. So things like the researcher's behavior slightly influencing you. Okay, if there's standardized procedures in place, it will reduce any of those investigator effects. And also, we can use single and double blind studies to reduce demand characteristics and investigator effects. So remember, single blind studies is when the participants will be unaware of what condition they're taking part in. Double blind studies are when the participant and the researcher are both, or neither of them know which part of the experiment they're involved in, whether they're in the control condition or the experimental condition. Okay, so there are ways of improving validity within a study. Use control groups, use standardized procedures, use double or single blind studies. When we're looking at questionnaires, one way to improve the validity is to incorporate a lie scale. And if any of you completed a long questionnaire that's been correctly constructed, it will have a lie scale in there. So what that does is it checks the consistency of your responses. So it might have a few different questions throughout it, which are asking the same thing but slightly differently. And therefore it's checking whether you're giving similar responses. And it also helps therefore control for effects of things like social desirability. And make sure that you're keeping and telling participants that their results are going to be anonymous. Okay, they're far more likely to give more honest answers to your questionnaire if they know that their results are going to be anonymous and their names aren't going to be used. So 3 good ways there to improve the validity in a questionnaire. When we're looking at observations, an observer should always be away. Okay, it should be a covert observation where the observer is hidden and away from sight, because therefore people are more likely to give natural or behave naturally. And also, when you're doing your observation checklist, you must have clear behavioural categories on there. They can't be too broad. They've got to be really, really specific behaviours. Like we've said previously, you can't have hugging and cuddling. They're too similar. You've got to have very clear behaviours that any observer who conducted the observation would tally off the same behaviours.